The 2024 election cycle tested the resilience of Arab and Muslim voters like never before. With the political landscape shifting and mounting pressure on the community, last year's election sparked urgent conversations about the future of Muslim political engagement. Welcome to Deep Dives with ISPU, a podcast by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. We're here to explore our latest one-of-a-kind research and data about topics affecting American Muslim communities today, featuring scholars and industry leaders from across the nation. In today's episode, we'll dive into how political mobilization, social justice, and community organizing played out during the 2024 election. We'll hear from activists, scholars, and community leaders who will share valuable insights on how to move forward from the 2024 election and its outcomes. To kick things off, we'll hear from Dr. Yousseff Chouhoud, an ISPU scholar and associate professor of political science at Newport University. Dr. Chouhoud is also affiliated with the Rife Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution. In this segment, he walks us through the increased political mobilization we saw post 9/11 and its resurgence in the wake of the 2024 elections. Despite a rise in activism, the election cycle posed major challenges for Muslim voters, especially with the war in Gaza taking center stage as a key issue. Here's Dr. Chouhoud breaking down his findings on Muslim voting behavior in key swing states, using a web app he created to visualize these shifts.
As we all know, the 2024 election cycle saw activism and political mobilization in the Arab and Muslim American communities to a degree that, perhaps we arguably haven't seen since 9/11. And one of the hallmarks of this movement was the effort to first, quote unquote, abandon Biden for his facilitation of Israeli atrocities in Gaza, and then subsequently to push back against Kamala Harris for not taking a principled stance on the genocide once she assumed the nomination. And so it was in this context that the political power of Arab and Muslim American voters became a salient issue. Again, arguably for the first time since 9/11. So with this increased salience, I began to notice some commentators, altogether dismissing these communities' ability to impact electoral outcomes, or alternatively, being, let's say, a bit too aggrandizing of our political heft. So being the insufferable nerd that I am, I thought I'd take a shot at perhaps estimating these communities' voting power in key swing states. So I pulled data from the US Census Bureau, from Mgauge, the Arab American Institute, among others, and I was able to build a model that provided at least a kind of minimally viable point of reference. But it was still housed in a fairly kind of inscrutable spreadsheet. I'm pulling out all the SAT words today. So I went ahead and took the extra step of creating a web app that intuitively and dynamically visualized this data. And for those of you who would like to try it out, who would like to kind of see what I found, you can find a link towards the bottom of my about page on my website, www.chouhoud.com. But just to give one kind of takeaway from the model, if say 35% of Arab and Muslim voters from 2020 chose to either vote third party or not vote at all in 2024, and another 5% actively switched their vote from the Democrats to the Republicans, that potential net loss in votes would have exceeded the margin of victory in Michigan and Pennsylvania in 2016, and would have exceeded the margin of victory in Georgia and Arizona in 2020. And again, we're only talking about Arabs and Muslims here, not other voters of conscience who would have likely supported the efforts of these communities. So the potential was certainly there for Arabs and Muslims to really flex their political muscle this past November, if the swing state races were as close as they were in the past couple of cycles. Of course, things didn't quite play out that way, with Donald Trump winning all the swing states by a comparatively comfortable margin. And so really this across-the-board red shift, as many have dubbed it, diluted Arab and Muslim Americans' kind of ability to influence any kind of individual state race, let alone the overall presidential outcome. Now, as far as how Muslims voted, there were a couple of exit polls that kind of made the rounds around election day and in the immediate aftermath. One of those was produced by the Council on American Islamic Relations, which reported that the majority of Muslims voted for Jill Stein, while around 20% voted for Trump and Harris, respectively. And so let me preface this by saying I have the utmost respect and admiration for the work that CARE does, but I think they may have missed the mark here. And so what makes me think that? Well, if you look at official voting data, so, like how people actually voted in Hamtramck, Michigan, the only Muslim majority city in the United States, or in Dearborn, Michigan, which has the largest concentrations of Arabs in the US. There we see that in Hamtramck, Harris had 48% of the vote, Jill Stein only 8%. Whereas in Dearborn, Michigan, Harris narrowly lost out to Trump, right? This was a big headline, whereas, Stein only got 15% of the vote. You see similar patterns in cities outside of Michigan as well, in Lackawanna, New York, in Paterson, New Jersey, where there are, again, large concentrations of Arabs and Muslims, respectively. And so all this is not to say that these cities are representative of the Muslim American or Arab American vote writ large. But if we were to see the kind of numbers that presumably Jill Stein was getting in the poll that CARE put out, we would have seen them right in these cities. That's effectively what my argument is. Now, at the same time, another poll came out during this time from the AP Votecast, which is a national survey of voters on the day of and in the days leading up to the election. So typically, national surveys have so few Muslim respondents that it's really not possible to glean anything useful from them. However, the sample size for the AP Votecast is well over 100,000. So even with only around 1% of them being Muslim, that's still a sizable portion, to have as a survey sample size. And in addition, given the AP's kind of more sophisticated methodology, this likely gives us the most accurate tally of American Muslim vote choice. So what did they find? Well, it was exceedingly anticlimactic. Effectively, the Democratic candidate got the exact same percentage of the vote in 2024. That is, Harris got 63% of the Muslim vote compared to what Biden got in 2020, which was 64%.
In the lead up to the 2024 election, there was a noticeable shift in Muslim voter behavior, with many distancing themselves from the Democratic Party compared to past cycles. While we may not have the exact numbers, it's clear that the issues at the forefront, particularly the war in Gaza, played a significant role. Dr. Chouhoud analyzed these shifts in Muslim political engagement and voter behavior. Here's Dr. Chouhoud sharing his insights.
So I think that there was certainly a sense among just any number of polls leading up to the election that there was no attachment to the Democratic Party, or that attachment had certainly kind of waned. And all the polls similarly kind of leading up to the election were kind of flashing a bright signal that Gaza was the main issue. But the thing is, you can have Gaza being the main issue, but not necessarily that leading you to a particular kind of vote choice. I mean, you can have somebody say Gaza is the main issue and I'm voting for this person, and have the same exact, another person say Gaza is my main issue, but I'm voting for this person, right? So the way that people interpret, how to actualize this policy choice, I think that is really what mattered most probably in this election. But kind of moving forward, how reliable, I guess, American Muslims are when it comes to being Democratic voters, that is certainly up in the air, and I don't think we have any kind of definitive answer on it now. But it's certainly something that I'm keeping an eye on, and the cycle that's coming up next midterm, and certainly for the 2028 presidential cycle as well. In terms of trends, American Muslims have kind of come full circle a little bit this past election cycle. So immediately post 9/11 and for a number of years thereafter, foreign policy was very top of mind when American Muslims and Arab Americans kind of went to the polls. However, in the past couple of election cycles, prior to 2023, domestic policies were very much at the forefront of what American Muslims were talking about amongst themselves, and also, what they reached out to their various, elected officials to discuss. And so I think now obviously this past election cycle, foreign policy has become very prominent once again. Um, Hopefully the reason for it being so prominent is now in the past, as the great news that Linda gave us, when she was speaking. But nonetheless, I think it will perhaps kind of remain a bit more top of mind kind of moving forward. But the big question is, it's kind of, what does this mean for, where American Muslims settle? So, as Sister Linda Sarsour was mentioning, there is this, and as we talked about, there is this kind of skepticism when it comes to the Democratic Party, and by no means should it be taken for granted that American Muslims moving forward will be kind of stalwart Democratic voters. I think it's really hard, though, to really kind of predict where we go from here, because, I mean, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you or any of the panelists or anybody really who's been paying attention for the past 8 years, Donald Trump is a kind of force of nature all his own, right? And so when Donald Trump kind of leaves the scene, this next election cycle in 2028, I think then we'll start to actually see, like, how American Muslims settle. Because prior to October 7th, 2023, I was fully expecting that, domestic issues around, a lot of things that, were kind of coded as, socially conservative issues regarding sexuality, regarding gender identity. I was fully expecting those to be, the things that really motivate American Muslim vote choice going into 2024. Obviously, a lot changed on October 7th. And so, is this simply just kind of a kind of quick detour from the trend that we will be getting to see, at least in the summer of 2023? Or is this kind of taking us down a different trajectory? I think that's kind of open at this point. And I don't think we're really going to have a sense of where American Muslims settle for a more kind of medium long term, until we see what they do in the midterm, and certainly in 2028 and even, 2030. I don't have anecdotal evidence in terms of voter turnout. What I will say, though, pick up off the point, perhaps depressing voter turnout numbers compared to all of the activism that we saw in the days, weeks, months leading up to the election, as well as what Salman was talking about in terms of ours being kind of ill prepared for a lot of the issues that were happening on college campuses. So back in 2006, when Hispanic and Latino Americans were going out and protesting the immigration policies that the George W. Bush administration was trying to enact. I mean, you talk to Hispanic and Latino leadership today, and they'll point to that time, to 2006, as like this was the pivot point, right? This was when our institutions began to coalesce. This was when a lot of the leadership started coming to the fore. And so even if we didn't get the result that we wanted, I think in 2024, in terms of turnout, in terms of our reaction to these challenges that we face kind of in real time, I think how we kind of use that energy moving forward, that's really what we need to kind of refocus on at this point, right? How do we kind of capture the energy that we got from this very painful month, year and a half, and kind of use that to really kind of propel our agenda and put us in a stronger position moving forward.
Building on Dr. Chouhoud's analysis, Imam Mika'il Stewart Saadiq underscores the importance of community unity and the need to define a collective political agenda. Known for his political and social activism, as well as his insightful commentary on Black and youth social issues, Imam Saadiq serves as assistant imam at the Muslim Center in Detroit, at the heart of the Muslim community in the area. Let's hear more about the critical role Muslim leaders play in shaping the future of political advocacy.
When we look at the political polarization of our country, and over the last maybe 15 years, how it has just been ramping up and increasing and intensifying, the rhetoric, the nastiness is for no better term I could think of, is just outright nasty. It's taking the focus away from those core democratic values. It's taking the focus away from civility. So when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gave the analogy about people on a boat, he said that, and just to paraphrase, he said that there comes a time where some people maybe try to knock holes in the bottom of the boat with good intentions out of maybe misinformation, disinformation, or emotionalism. But there must be a time where the people that are of conscience, right? The people that understand what's all at stake, the people that don't want to drown, right? The people that don't want to destroy the boat, the people that want to get to a collective, prosperous future and destination, we must do our best to figure out some way to stop those people. So I guess that's my best explanation of it for those who are not familiar with the hadith. Of course, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and I'm biased as an imam, of course, he's more eloquent and best at explaining any of these things. But as far as our political agenda, and I've been speaking on this for years, being an American government teacher, civics teacher in the middle and high school levels for 20 years, I have had the privilege of learning how the next generation of Muslims and those that are acquiring their education are being socialized by American plurality, how they are thinking, what they're expecting of us. First, we have to understand, you have to define your we, right? We're all familiar with the verse of Quran, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Whereas, we always quote that, especially imams. It's almost every khutbah, at least once a month, you're going to hear that in the khutbah, that ayat. But it is translated where Allah Almighty tells us, do not be divided, right? Hold on to the rope of Allah altogether and do not be divided. And a lot of times we have, in my opinion, sometimes an unrealistic or delusional expectation of unity. Anything that's worth having, and we know this as being adults and parents and people that work in these spaces, politics and policy, it's challenging. And what we call jihad in Islam, struggling. But there's a reward in it. Anything that is worth having, anything that is valuable, usually entails some degree of struggle. So our diversity, we must define our we. As you know, in public policy, public opinion, there's many publics. The Muslim community is made of many publics. We have to do a critical analysis of how we view and value diversity. How we view and value diversity. And it doesn't mean that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah most glorified and praiseworthy, most high, when Allah says do not be divided, hold on to the rope of Allah. The rope of Allah are the principles of the Quran, the tenets of al-Islam, the character, role modeling of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. That's what we're holding on to. Our core identity of Islam and Hidayah, or guidance from Allah. But do not be divided. That means don't be divided on that. Don't be divided that God is one. Don't be divided on the core tenets of Islam. But there's room for us to be separate and have some division in other things because we're a part of many publics. As you hear us always saying, the Muslim community is not what? Homogenous. not a monolith. When we say that anecdotally sometimes, but we really have to have a critical analysis of that. So that's the first bullet point, I would say, in how we draft a national political agenda. We have to lean into our diversity, acknowledge it, and accept it. And then we have to be smart. And many of us are familiar with the organizing of SMART goals, right? So first of all, it has to be, of course, specific, measurable, attainable. And I really want to focus on that. We have to be realistic. What is attainable? What are the ubiquitous things? What are things that are more common, more similar to what Dr. Chouhoud said, more salient, issues. And then we have to, support one another in that. We talk about allyship a lot, but we don't talk about advocacy a lot, right? Because of course, all advocates are allies, but not all allies are advocates, right? Right. And we must accept that a sincere commitment to cooperation is always better than a performative Muslim unity. And we're good at that as Muslims, because we're supposed to be nice people. So a lot of times we will behave like, this is what unity looks like. But in fact, it's tacit, right? And it's it's a lot of times ethnocentric. So in order to allow us all to benefit, right? And as the saying goes about more boat references, right? About the tide, right? Raising all the boats. We want to be able to come to agreement with some things that emphasizes agency of all of those Muslim publics, and that also lean into the core democratic values. We have to be bold and brave. We have to be bold and brave enough to hold up the Quran, right? And that doesn't mean being so strict in religiosity, but we have to be bold and brave and hold up the Quran, consider our Islam a gift, and also value free exercise of religion, and also the Establishment Clause. We don't want anyone running our lives by their religious interpretations, and we should not allow our religious interpretation to run anyone else's lives. This is the Muslim community's time to really shoulder leadership in America, and really add our voice and all of our particular talents. The Muslim leaders, our religious leaders, have to take a page out of Reverend Dr. King's book. And by the way, hey, today is Dr. King's birthday, right? But seriously, the religious leaders in the Black community are not just clerics, don't just pontificate, right? Are not just preachers. They are community leaders, right? They impact policy. And we know that when we study Dr. King, we study, of course, we talk about Malcolm X, rahimahullah. So we do not have to reinvent the wheel, but we do, and I've seen some of our participants mention this, we do have to reconcile with how we place value on people and things. And we have to really fight our inclination to ethnocentrism, right? And we have to embrace American pluralism and understand when we talk about the Islamic principles of justice and equality, equality means that everyone has the same opportunities under the law. And this doesn't stop me from expressing myself Islamically. We have to understand these things.
Expanding on the discussion of political and social engagement, Imam Saadiq addresses a growing concern within the Muslim community, the rise of red pill philosophy and its increasing influence on younger Muslims, especially among some young men. Imam Saadiq explains the challenges this rhetoric poses to the Muslim community and explores how it's shaping the perspectives and attitudes of youth. Here's what he had to say.
I think most of you have seen it's sort of becoming more pervasive that Muslims and younger Muslims and some of the young men particularly are feeling marginalized. And that's something that I would like to speak to as far as the Muslim community. And I would even, just advise even some of the Democrats, the Muslim community cannot be afraid to speak to men. And, the philosophy and the approach to progression, to equality, equity, it's not a zero-sum game, right? But what's happening is that in the effort, to really grow and, like Sister Linda said, to become politically mature, a lot of times, a lot of people feel abandoned and left to the wayside. So we can't be afraid to acknowledge that our community is socially conservative, or has been socialized in a conservative sense. We really have high marriage rates. We have those traditional family values, and we don't shy away from what is considered traditional family roles. But we're also, Americans, and we also live in one of the most pluralistic societies, one of the most robust democracies in the world, alhamdulillah, with all these civil liberties. So sometimes there becomes a conflict, and what our leaders and our thinkers and our community people, what we have to start doing, our politicians, our policy people, what we have to start doing is actually speaking to that. We can't turn away from it. We can't consider people backward or people misogynistic if they're saying, hey, what about the men? So that's something that I just really want to highlight. We cannot be afraid to talk to men. We have to give safe spaces for men. And this is coming from a pastoral care perspective. You give safe spaces for people to vent, and then you give them correct information. You have to debunk the misinformation, right? Let them know where they're actually playing into biases. And then, we can begin to heal and get people on a track to not support movements or even candidates that are actually working against their advancement of being minorities or people of color and minority religious people. When I was in high school here in Detroit, we went through a lot of anti-racism training with the PACE group. And one of the things they did is showing us, and what the Muslim community has to understand about social activism, we have to learn how to become advocates. I represent you in spaces that you may not have access to, and vice versa. So as an African American convert to Islam, I've had to stand up, for Islam on one hand, but also demystify Arabs, even teach people how to say Arab properly, right? So, and I'm sure many of you that are in these spaces and in this work do the same. But when we talk about social justice and activism, also, we don't have to stray away from our Islamic tenets. Hey, I signed the Elliott Larson. There was a petition here in Michigan for the Elliott Larson bill to include the LGBTQ community as a protected class, and also I signed a referendum that would make it illegal to discriminate against LGBTQ community persons for housing. And I'm like, housing is a human right, but I've never had to wear a rainbow sash around my neck. I've never had to do anything that compromises my beliefs. And as long as we're standing on the First Amendment, which gives us freedom of religion, then we're safe. And I think that, so a lot of our social justice advocates, hey, the Prophet ﷺ told them, I'm not a farmer, right? When they destroyed the trees for his advice, he said, I'm not a farmer. So what we have to do is have an appreciation for the individual worth of all of the talented professionals in our community, and have shura, true Islamic shura, and then we'll be able to really serve our community and really empower people to get their legs up under them when they go out into the community to be social justice advocates and activists, inshallah.
Shifting the lens to a deeper look at the 2024 elections, Linda Sarsour, a Palestinian-American civil rights activist and co-founder of Mpower Change, emphasizes the critical disconnect between political rhetoric and real power. She calls for the Muslim community to redirect its efforts towards local politics as a way to create lasting change.
Sometimes we have to speak the truth to one another in order for us to be better, to become a better community, to be a more effective and strategic community. And Dr. Yousseff shared a little bit of this from a kind of data perspective or research perspective. But a lot of the rhetoric that we saw coming out of some element of our community did not translate into political power at the polls. And the Muslim American community has unfortunately found people to take credit for the kind of defeat of Kamala Harris and the defeat of the Democratic Party. But in fact, the ones that were the loudest voices were asking people to vote for Jill Stein. So, in fact, if that was true, that rhetoric that really mobilized our community, we would have saw a higher turnout for third party candidates like Dr. Cornel West and Jill Stein. And the data is there. There's no manipulation of data. You could look and see where there were third party voters and where there was not. And of course, there was an element of our community that voted for Donald Trump in places like Michigan. That also is factual information, and that did happen. But a majority of our people didn't go to the polls, and that's just the bottom line. And so, in order for us to be an effective and strategic community, we got to do a few things. And the number one thing is we got to build consensus in our community. We're not all going to agree on things, and that's just the bottom line. This idea that our Muslim community is this one homogeneous community, that we all from the same places, that we all prioritize things the same, is just not true. And it's not true because I know it's not true. I knock doors. This is what I do for a living. I am in the community. I am face to face with people in our community. And there are people who are concerned about a plethora of issues, right? Some of them being foreign policy, some of them being domestic issues. And of course, Gaza was top of mind for many voters, which is why many voters decided that they didn't feel like they saw a resolution under a second Democratic administration under a Kamala Harris or a Biden. And they also knew that it isn't going to be that much better for us under a Donald Trump. So a lot of people said, Sister Linda, I'm skipping the top of the ticket. I'm going to go to the polls. And we actually saw that. I mean, we saw that happen. So, for example, in places like Michigan and Dearborn, we saw the election, for example, of Amir Zahid and Jamal Jahmi on the local school board in a place where Kamala Harris lost. I mean, this is how our community is not as ignorant as we think they are. They are people with their own minds. They are the people who are making decisions based on the information that they're receiving and also based on who's organized them. Jamal Jahmi was knocking their doors. Jamal Jahmi had young people all across Dearborn who were basically going to community centers, going to the masajid, going and galvanizing people around his school board race. So what I learned, and I already knew this, but it was confirmed for me, is that it's about organizing. It's not about what you post on social media. It's not about having a big following on social media. It's not about getting headlines in the papers, because the Muslim community, the people we're trying to organize, most of them are not reading the Washington Post. They're not reading Political. They're not reading the social media accounts that are putting these flashy headlines about abandoning any certain candidate. So for our community moving forward, if we want to coalesce around some sort of campaign targeting people of different parties for things, it's going to require, are you ready to put your sentiment to action? Are you ready to knock the doors? Are you ready to raise the money required for us to organize? In order to mobilize voters, you need to have access to the voter files. You need to be able to figure out where are the Muslims, in what districts are the Muslims, who are the double prime voters, who are the people that didn't vote in 2020 election, and try to assess and decide who our target audiences are. And so what I saw in this last election, and I don't want to critique our people too much, because we are organizing from a place of deep trauma. We are so traumatized. We were horrified by the Biden administration and Kamala's silence, which translated to a lot of people as complicity in the genocide of the Palestinian people. I personally am from New York, thank God, and I don't have the same pressure on me as a New Yorker. I didn't have to vote for Kamala Harris in New York. That's just the privilege that I have as a New York voter. But we also saw New York as another example. Donald Trump won 46% of the vote in New York City. I mean, this is New York, my friends. Like, there's something that's bubbling here. And I think finally what I walked away from this election with a little bit heartbroken, because I feel like what we saw from our own community as I analyzed some of the data is that our community doesn't feel like they belong in any political party. They just don't. They don't feel Republican. They don't feel Democrat. They don't feel like the kind of political establishment is really taking into account our concerns, our priorities, the things that move us. And it makes me sad. And so the solution for me is really going back to building local. Like, let's elect people who align with our values locally. And places like Michigan are doing that. We see that here in New York City. We see that in cities and towns across the country. Stop focusing on federal politics, which is, in my opinion, the process is not the same. There's the power that we yield on a local level is much greater than we have on the federal level. And let's start organizing for 2028. If you want a presidential candidate in 2028 who's going to lean into Muslim community causes or speak to our values or speak to, you got to start now. And we got to be united. And when I say unity, and I say as a community, a lot of people talk about this idea of unity. I always say to Muslims, unity is not uniformity. I could be aligned with you. We could be a united front and still have some disagreements or some different type of prioritization of if you're Palestinian versus if you're a Black Muslim versus if you are, from the Indo-Pakistani or whatever. Every community is going to have rank their issues differently, but eventually what we'll find is a lot of overlap, a lot of consensus that we can build to put our, to bring our community together. And again, what moves me and motivates me is the Palestinian people. It is how are we going to build enough power so that we don't get into the situation ever again, that we are able to help lift the siege on Gaza and the occupation of the Palestinian people. And I promise you that for me, that is the goal. Why? Because we know if we can do that for the Palestinian people, we're going to be able to do that for Indians and Indian Muslims in India. We will be able to do that and continue to support our Syrian sisters and brothers and our brothers and sisters in Egypt and in Yemen and in the African continent. There's so much that can come from us building political power. And so again, I felt disappointed during the election. And I also felt that we gave a lot of influence and power. And I don't mean us as imams or organizers or activists or nonprofit leaders, but some in our community, like our lay members, a lot of people gave a lot of power to people with the biggest mics on the internet. So instead of giving the power to those with the strategy, those with the history, those with the expertise, we just let anybody get on the internet and start telling us what to do politically when they have never invested in the long-term plan or the long-term work that we've been doing to build political power in the Muslim American community.
As the November election approached, Muslim political coalitions began to splinter. Long known as the religious group with the largest portion of voters considering themselves independent, polling shows a majority of Muslims voted for the Democratic candidate for president since the Bush era. The fault lines exposed in the 2024 election raised important questions about the future of those relationships and the path forward for movement building and allyship. Let's explore what is needed beyond coalition building to continue empowering the Muslim community and building sustained political influence.
I will say that those relationships continue to exist, and there are many of us that continue to cultivate those relationships, continue to share sentiment of our communities, share concerns, share areas where we do agree. And I want to, just put this out there because I think that this is a question that's often framed wrong in the community. There's always this targeting of like, well, the Democratic left is too left for the Muslims. We don't align with this party. Interestingly enough, you also don't align with the Republican Party. So I'm just trying to understand where people are here and getting ourselves into a place where we are clear about what our identity is. And again, finding places where we do agree. We don't have to work with people on things that we may not agree on. That's just, no one forces us into that. I think there are many issues that have galvanized our Muslim American communities over the years, issues around national security reform, issues around police brutality and police accountability, civil rights and civil liberties issues, things like immigration and refugees and the ways in which our country assists refugees in this country, discrimination, employment discrimination policies, strengthening anti-hate crime legislation. There's just so much space, high quality public education, workers' rights, economic justice issues, raising wages for workers, pushing for workers' protections. Many of our union members across the country are people who are Muslims, are people who are also members of immigrant communities that are from our community. There's so many issues, like 100 issues that are impacting our community, and oftentimes some of our Muslim American organizations, they try to put us in these categories, and we're not in those categories. We are people who are impacted by so many things. I care about about my property taxes and when they go up and when they go down. I care about whether my streets are paved. I care about whether the mayor of New York City is plowing the streets when there is a snowstorm. There are so many little issues that if you went to knock on Muslim homes and said to them, what is your top priority issue? Some people are going to say, look, I'm having a hard time paying my mortgage. I'm having a hard time paying my rent. My job is requiring me to go get another job in order for me. And in Dearborn, people will tell you, people are restaurant workers. And then guess what they do in the evening times? And I talk to them all the time because that's just who I am. I'm an organizer, and I'm going to organize you when I'm with you in a car. I've been with Uber drivers in places like Dearborn who tell me that this is their second job. And for some of them, it's their third job. So again, I keep telling our Muslim community, this is not about aligning with any ideological, spectrum or part of the political spectrum. It's about, who are you? What are the things that you care about, that other communities care about, that we could work together? And I'm not a religious scholar. I never claim to be. I don't speak on behalf of, Islam. That's not my job. But I also am a student, just like many of us are, many people here are. We know that our beloved Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him, did go into contract with other tribes and communities when there were things we agreed on only. And we put the things we don't agree on right to the side. And so I still think that that's a pathway for our Muslim American communities to build consensus. Let's work on the issues that impact our people. Let us never be a hindrance to other communities. But at the same time, there is ways for us to alleviate the suffering that our own people are experiencing in this country and abroad, and be strategic about it, and be able to have the courageous conversations. Like, the other thing that I will say about our community is there's so much misinformation. People will say, oh, Sister Linda, she's like, a lefty radical in our community, whatever. Like, you don't know me. Let's have a conversation. Ask me what I believe and what I don't believe. Oh, brother, Yousseff, he just doesn't like this particular group, which is why he's saying that. Our community just has to become a bit more mature. And we also and I said this earlier, and I'll kind of end with this, let us respect the expertise of people in our community. When someone emails me and says, Sister Linda, I'm having a spiritual crisis, immediately my response is, I'm so sorry to hear that. Here are incredible people in our community that you should reach out to. If you're a woman, reach out to Rabata, Sister Ansa Tamara Gray. There are women scholars in our community that you can consult on spiritual guidance and advice. There are imams in our community. There are actual, Muslim campus life and others. If you're a student, like, there's so much chaplain groups that you can reach out to. But if we're talking about political advocacy, strategic building alliances in our community, let's go with the experts. Let's go with the people with the track records here, right? And I think oftentimes in our community, we start mistaking what our expertise are, or we start giving credence to people in our community, with all due respect to them, that don't have this expertise. Like, there should be no reason why imams in our community are setting forth a political strategy. That is not their expertise. That is not the role that they play in the community. They should continue to play their important role. And there could be more relationship building between the kind of activist organizer and the kind of religious scholarly folks in our community, because I think that there could be much more productive work. And lastly, I'll say this to the student groups. I mean, as you know, I have the privilege of speaking on many college campuses across the country, and our students struggle. They struggle because when they are on a college campus organizing, for example, an encampment, and they have all these young people who are saying, we are with you. We stand with you in solidarity with the Palestinian people. We are willing to put our bodies on the line. We will protect you. We will go up against police officers. We'll go up against right-wing Zionists. But then an Islamic scholar will say, oh, wait a minute. You have to be selective about who comes to your encampment. We can't, this makes absolutely no sense. And then you put our young people in a situation that says, wait a minute. Am I not to accept solidarity from people who are prioritizing me? prioritizing my pain in this moment. So again, there's a lot of confusion in our community. And I think the solution to that is let us access people and organizations in our community based on expertise. And when we believe that an organization or an individual in our community may, in fact, be, I don't know, engaging in something that we don't necessarily agree with, why don't we say, hey, Brother Salman, come to the table. I'd love to have a conversation with you, get some clarity. Sister Linda, let's have a conversation and get some clarity. But unfortunately, we don't do that in the Muslim community. And we end up with these different tracks. And then our people are in a situation where they have to choose. Do I follow the student groups? Do I follow Sister Linda's advice? Do I follow Imam so-and-so's advice? Do I do this? Do I do that? And just to be clear, and I'll say this about Imam Mika'il as an example, there are some imams in our community who are actually community organizers. They are outside in the street. They are building alliances. They are building with churches and building with synagogues and temples, etc. So I'm not saying that those people don't overlap sometimes, but there are some who do not overlap, who are given credence that I don't think that they are going to be guiding our community on a political level. And someone said this in the chat, and I want to make sure that they feel heard here. When I said earlier that, we need to organize towards 2028, and I meant that on a presidential level, because that was where it was the most contentious. It seemed like oftentimes on a local level, we agreed on candidates. People supported Jamal Bowman. They supported Corey. They supported members of Congress and people running for school board, but it was very contentious on the federal level. And so what I'm saying to people is I'm organizing today. I don't know if folks know, we have a mayoral candidate in New York City named Zahran Mamdani, a young Indian American Muslim, also Ugandan citizen, who's running for mayor. Look locally. And I said this, and Imam laughed at me, and he was like, I don't know if that's the right way to use this, but I'm going to use it here to all of you. Lower your gaze as Muslims when it comes to politics. Oftentimes, we're always worried about who's in the White House, when really what happens in the White House or what happens in Congress doesn't actually trickle down to your local community in the same way that who your mayor is, or who your city council members, who your school board members is. So instead of worrying about who's in the White House, who's in your city hall? Who's sitting in your state legislator that's making decisions about whether your property taxes are 10% higher than they were last time, or whether your water bill is higher, or who's monopolizing your electricity grid, right? In New York City, I don't know if you folks know, my electricity bill 1 month during the summer was $900 because I'm privileged to have central air conditioning in my house. But my point is, again, is I appreciate this conversation that the ISPU is facilitating, and I hope that we do many more of these, because I think more people need to be brought into this conversation. And sometimes we need to ask the hard questions, and that's okay too. And I appreciate all the speakers that came here today, because each of us brings a different expertise and a different community that we're trying to mobilize. And me personally, I'm going to continue this work. Our community is probably one of the most difficult communities to organize. I tell people all the time, my community ages me 20 years every election cycle. But alhamdulillah, I'm still here. And inshallah, we will see ourselves and learn from our mistakes and learn from the challenges. And we're going to rise to the next 4 years under a Donald Trump presidency. Because I'll just say it's not going to be easy, my friends. I don't care what somebody told you. And I know Allah is the best of planners, and I believe in all of that. But Allah also told us to tie our camels, and we're going to have to, politics for me in America is about tying your camels. And so the question to the Muslim community, are you truly tying your camels? And the last question I will leave people with is, when we think about most recently the last 15 months of genocide, are we really building the community that our people in Gaza are proud of? Do you believe that the people of Gaza believe that we are a powerful, effective Muslim American community that is using every privilege, every power, every leverage that we have to help alleviate the suffering of our people? I don't believe that we are the community right now, because it is American planes that have dropped those bombs for the last 15 months. And we have not been able, not a single one of us has been able to even move foreign policy, even a minute, a second. We have not stopped a genocide, sisters and brothers, in 15 months. We did nothing for the Palestinian people, even though they appreciate our solidarity more rhetorically and maybe in words, but really on the level of, did we shift anything? Did anything stop? Did our people stop dying over the last 15 months? They did not. And I hope that people sit with that as we move forward, building a true political power for our communities, in hopes that it impacts our people abroad as well.
2024 brought many lessons in political organizing for the Muslim community. As we continue exploring the path forward, we turn back to Linda for her insights on the challenges of organizing within the Muslim community. She also shares her advice on how the community can channel energy in the most productive way as we look ahead to the next 4 years.
I'd say the biggest challenge that I have, I think I've said multiple times here today, and that is the challenge of really asserting some of our own expertise, right? And having to compete with folks that do not have the same expertise as we do. And so that's been a challenge to try to either get folks who are trying to advise our community politically to at least at some point have a conversation so we can provide the resources, the tools, the talking points, the power analysis that we have. We power map, we analyze. This is not just we wake up one morning and this is what we're going to do. This is really many years of work, including identifying Muslim voters in the voter activation network. This is something that is a long-term project that I've had, where inside of the voter activation network file, which is basically the names and information of every registered voter in the country, being able to identify the Muslims so we're able to do better outreach, more precise outreach to Muslim Americans, has been something that I've worked on at least for the last decade. And so again, the challenge is being able to build consensus and develop one strategic plan for the Muslim community to follow that encompasses our disagreements, right? That allows us to work from a place of consensus, that does not force us into some homogeneous, everybody has to believe the same things, but really says, here are the top 5 issues that unite our people. Here's the top 5 issues that we're going to use to build political power. The message that I have for people, and I say this to people all the time, all politics is local, folks. I promise you, that is where the real impact is. I need you to participate on a local level. There are elections every single year in your local areas. Sometimes multiple elections are happening in one year. As you know, even in places like Michigan, there are sometimes special elections, there are primary elections. Sometimes your primary elections are on different days, depending on what level of office people are running for. There are general elections. So every year there are elections. And as local as possible, even in Michigan, I learned something for the first time, that people can run to be on the board of trustees of the universities. I didn't know that, because that's not something we have, for example, in New York. The fact that students could have had more pro-Palestinian, more Muslim, more Arab American leaders on the university board of trustees could have really impacted the ways in which the universities responded to the student encampments. That's where the local power is. So participate, run for your local school board. A lot of times people say, Sister Linda, who am I to run for school board? No, you are actually the right person. If you are a parent of New York City, or excuse me, of public school students in general, anybody can run. For God's sakes, if Donald Trump could be the president of the United States of America, you could be a city council member. You could be a local commissioner. So run for office. For those of you who have children in the public school system, join the Parent Teacher Association. Like, we're not asking people here to become, rocket scientists. We are asking you to participate in the society in which you live. And so in order for Muslims to stop saying, nobody cares about us, nobody listens to us, well, if you're not at the table, how are they supposed to listen to you? Like, I don't know how there's a table being set, you're not on it, but we're also complaining that we're not being listened to. So participate, also join organizations. There are many organizations in all of our cities that are Muslim-led organizations that are building power, that are doing youth and leadership development, that are providing resources, that are registering voters. Join those organizations, support those organizations, and also support the organizations like ISPU, who is doing the research, who's allowing us to be better, well-informed about what our people need and what our people are saying. There's been many ISPU research over the years where people would say, this is what the Muslim community cares about, even before the genocide. And then when the ISPU report comes out, it's not what you said it was, because you're assuming what you think our people want. So ISPU supporting organizations that are, our students on college campuses, sponsoring student groups. If you are a masjid, for example, in, Dallas, Texas, why don't you sponsor students at the University of Texas, making sure that those MSAs, those SJPs feel like they have a community behind them. So my message is really, all politics are local. Lower your gaze. Don't worry about what's happening up there in Washington, D.C. Don't worry about what's happening in the big debates nationally. Leave that to us. We'll worry about that. Look inward and let's build powerful, organized, strategic local communities. And I promise you, that's going to be able to impact the federal level, and it will eventually impact our people in countries abroad. Because when you build local power, then the candidates that emerge in your communities to run for Congress, to run for the state legislature, eventually are going to have to be forced or moved or inspired to align with your values, because they're like, I need these people. I need this community right here. Whatever they're talking about, I got to be in tune with that because I need those votes in order for me to win office.
We can't talk about the challenges of political organizing without recognizing the brave Muslim students on U.S. campuses who have been at the forefront of protesting for Gaza. Salman Khan, co-founder of Muslim Campus Life, a 501c3 organization advocating for Muslim students, and a PhD candidate at Harvard University studying education and social inequality, shares his insights on how the reduction in student protests and a shifting political landscape are impacting the next generation of activists. As someone who has worked closely with these students, Salman reminds us of the importance of nurturing their leadership, providing support, and ensuring that their voices continue to be heard during these challenging times.
So did the activism this past year and a half spark a sustainable shift? And I think that's the key word here, in youth involvement in the political system. I think it could have, but truthfully, I don't think we were ready for this moment as a community. And if I'm being honest, I think on many fronts, we actually failed our students with few rare exceptions. Our students really experienced the consequences and lived through this unpreparedness on so many different levels. And I think it's important to mention here that we saw President Claudine Gay at Harvard, Manu Shafiq at Columbia, and Elizabeth McGill at Penn, and a few others afterwards actually as well, being forced to resign from their position as university presidents because they were pro-Palestinian, not because they called for Palestinian self-determination. They were forced to resign because they were seen as too lenient on pro-Palestinian students who had the audacity to speak up on campus. These university presidents were dragged through the mud, brought down to Congress, publicly and nationally ridiculed during congressional hearings, all because they didn't censor or crack down on pro-Palestinian students enough or hard enough. And let's just review quickly what our students experienced over the past year and a half. Students were doxxed with their addresses being posted online, and in some instances, even their parents' addresses being posted online. Students had their faces plastered on digital trucks that were driving around major cities like Boston and New York. I personally saw those trucks driving around campus, calling students all sorts of vile names across the Boston area. Students lost so many job opportunities. We had multiple incidents of Muslim students and pro-Palestinian students at top law schools across the country lose their prestigious law firm jobs because they spoke up or were affiliated with pro-Palestinian activism on campus. We saw students being stalked after attending protests or simply for wearing a hijab or a keffiyeh on campus. We saw students getting sprayed with chemical weapons by former IDF soldiers who are now university students, resulting in hospitalization, with some students having burning sensations in their eyes for several days and not being able to clearly see for many days afterwards. We saw students who were in encampments being, having sprinklers turned on the middle of the night and at 3 and 4 a.m. in the morning in freezing winter conditions. We saw students getting physically attacked by non-university affiliates at places like UCLA. We saw our spaces being broken into and vandalized, like at the Center for Islamic Life at Rutgers University on the day and morning of Eid. We saw, and that also happened at UConn actually as well, we saw students being the targets of hit and runs at Stanford University, and we even had students who were shot at. We had the case of Hisham, Kenan, and Tahsin near the University of Vermont campus. And none of this was enough. Universities were expected to make our students suffer even more for speaking up. And there was a quote from an Israeli foreign minister who spoke to a group of student activists who said something along the lines of, the second front of the war is being fought on college campuses. And I don't necessarily agree with that framing, but if we did, we left our students defenseless this past year and a half in many instances. And let's just clarify that we're talking about university spaces. These are supposed to be bastions of free speech, bastions of academic freedom, for dialogue, for conversation. And we saw in these spaces that universities were resorting to violence. Universities were calling local and state police departments to remove student protesters from campus. And so it became crystal clear that students would be mercilessly attacked and villainized for speaking up. And we should also mention that this applied to faculty and staff too. Many Muslim chaplains were blatantly told not to attend or visit student encampments. And I know many students felt frustrated and alone, and some community leaders even called chaplains out because of this, because they felt that chaplains were not supporting their students. But to be frank, this is a shortcoming of our community as well. We are not funding our own institutions and centers on college campuses. We are not funding the salaries of many Muslim chaplains. And so colleges may offer to hire Muslim chaplains and support staff, but we have to understand that there are trade-offs when that happens, when we are not the ones funding them. And so there are limitations in place for what they can say and can't say. And just this past week, we saw a Muslim chaplain being fired from her position for being, in her opinion, too pro-Palestine. I won't disclose that because that's still sort of fresh news. I won't disclose who it is, but this is sort of happening even at the staff level. And so we have to, I just want to be clear too, I'm very sympathetic to our Muslim chaplains and the experience that they've had over the past year and a half, but we have to start investing in the development of Muslim campus life on different college campuses so that our staff can even start to support our students. And just this past week, we witnessed this on a faculty level. Catherine Frank, who is a tenured Columbia law professor, had to enter early retirement for making comments about what happened at Columbia University regarding the skunk chemical spray. And to be clear, Columbia did do an investigation and they claimed that this was not a chemical weapon. It was just a non-toxic fart spray in their own words. But regardless of the situation, this professor simply pointed out that students who previously served in the IDF may come to campus and make Palestinian and Muslim students feel unsafe. And this was enough for her to be dragged through the mud and lose her position as a tenured faculty member and being forced into early retirement. At Indiana University, we saw another example of this with Professor Abdulkader Sino getting banned from teaching for a whole semester because he simply booked a room on campus for an event that the Palestinian Solidarity Committee was hosting. This was not in regards to statements that he had made or anything like that. This was simply for booking a room. So even the smallest sort of actions supporting pro-Palestinian students was seen as a violation of university conduct. And by the way, just fun fact for everyone, one of the two students who was accused of throwing the skunk spray at students at Columbia University was awarded a $395,000 settlement by the university for what was deemed to be an excessive punishment for throwing a chemical spray onto student protesters. That person was awarded a settlement close to $400,000. I've yet to hear of a settlement for Abdul Wahab at Stanford, who was the target of the hit and run, or Hisham Kanaan or Tahseen after being shot at. But this is sort of the state of affairs that we're in right now. And while there are some bright spots, like at Rutgers University, where we had an established institution like the Center for Islamic Life at Rutgers, and shout out to Ati Aftab and their board and Gaisar Aslam, the Muslim chaplain there, for doing amazing work in establishing what we might consider one of the first versions of a Muslim Hillel or a Muslim Newman Center on campus. They had probably the most successful encampment by far. And that was due to the longstanding ties to the administration that they had built over several years and them being able to negotiate on behalf of students with the campus administration. Outside of these very few examples, the vast majority of students were left to fend for themselves over the past year and a half. As a result of all this, to answer the question, the vast majority of students have stopped engaging in political action on campus for Palestine. And I would say are disengaging on a broader level as well with the political process. Many voices on campus have gone silent, and we've seen a sharp drop-off in campus protests in both the number and frequency of the protests taking place, but also in terms of the intensity of the protests taking place. There was a public narrative that was displaying a lot of the student encampments and protests as violent and aggressive and all these sorts of things. But that was completely false and misrepresentative of these protests and movements. And this is not me saying this. This is the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. They conducted a study of over 130 encampments that encompassed over 3,000 days of student protests over the 2023-2024 academic year. And they found very few incidents of property damage, less than 1%. It was 0.008% of incidents where incidents of property damage took place, and even fewer incidents of injuries to counter-protesters. On the flip side, more than 3,600 students were arrested from the pro-Palestinian sort of movement, with many schools in democratic states like UCLA being the top arresters. UCLA arrested over 250 students over the course of that year, which is almost an arrest a day. So I just want to make sure that framing is very clear and that we clear the fog on that sort of the misrepresentation that took place. But in terms of changes that took place this academic year, on the intensity piece that I mentioned earlier, I mentioned at the end of my comments previously that we've seen a reduction in the frequency and number of protests, but also in terms of the intensity. And it's important to note, to your question, that dozens of universities have updated their student conduct policies and student handbooks to limit free speech, limit the ability of students to protest, limit the ability to hold encampments, and to just dampen this movement, broadly speaking. And many of these changes took place over the summer so that students came back from the previous academic year to a new set of rules on the ground. And shout out to Dr. Nancy Khalil, who is documenting and researching these student policy changes at the University of Michigan. At Cornell, and just to give some examples of how this sort of panned out, at Cornell this past September, students protested a career fair that featured defense contractors. And since then, 4 students were banned from the Cornell campus for 3 years. And so these students were automatically unenrolled from their courses and were no longer allowed to step foot on campus for this 3-year period. And we are, again, seeing this play out in real time. Just this past week at NYU, students released leaflets and flyers from the top of the library. If you visited the NYU campus, it's like a square with, they released flyers from the top. And now students are not allowed to enter certain buildings, and their sort of fate is yet to be determined in terms of the disciplinary hearings. At Swarthmore College, we saw some even more, I would say, ridiculous incidents. 11 students are now facing assault charges because of the use of a megaphone during a protest, right? So the university had updated their student handbook to make loud chanting a form of assault. So these students are at risk of being expelled now, given this incident. At Harvard, we saw students go from hosting an encampment in the spring to coming back to a new set of rules. And now, they hosted a study-in at the library that was completely silent, only lasted for an hour. All the students did was sit wearing, whatever they wore, keffiyehs and other things, and had signs. There was no disruption. There was no talking. They had abided by university and library rules, but every single one of those students were banned from the library as a result of that. And so these sorts of policy changes have continued to dampen, I would say, the student movement. And now let's layer on this new rhetoric from the incoming Trump administration. And I think things are just going to get even worse. And so if I was to largely bucket the different groups of students who are on campus, who are involved in campus protests or not involved, I would say the first sort of group were these students who are very involved from the beginning of the protests and continue to be active until now. The second were lightly or marginally involved. Maybe they came to an encampment to visit, they hung out with students, but then ultimately left. And then the third were students who were not involved at all. And I think there's some interesting research from Dr. Mohammed Abbasi, who is at Rutgers University, who studied the political participation of young Muslims before and after October 7th. And it actually, according to his research, seems to be the more religious students who actually fall into this first and second bucket of being less politically active, but we'll put that aside for now. I think that's sort of an interesting conversation to have. But the rhetoric of the Trump administration, from my vantage point, will simply push out that middle group of students into the extremes of the distribution. And so while some students may become even more outspoken and more emboldened, I think the vast majority are going to be much more quiet, especially in light of the lack of community support that we've seen, right? And so they're just going to focus on their studies, not disrupt the waters too much, focus on graduating, not try to get doxxed, and not try to experience any of the negative things that we've sort of talked about and outlined earlier. So a key operating principle and message that we have tried to disseminate to the community at Muslim Campus Life is that the higher education space is not just a transactional space where you pay some tuition, you take some classes, and you get a job, and you don't ever think about it ever again. It is a transformational space that we have to invest in as a community, where student beliefs will be changed and challenged. Students will meet new people, so their social environment will change dramatically, their way of thinking will change dramatically. And so, again, we have to invest in that space. And one of the key ways that we want folks to recognize that these spaces are spaces of power, cultural capital, and influence is by being active alum, as Sister Linda pointed out. I think this is a key message. If you take one thing away from my presentation, at least today, go back to your alma mater and see how you can get involved as an alum of the institution. Start donating monthly to the Muslim program on the campus. Start talking to folks, get involved in the Alumni Association, and start to strive, as Sister Linda pointed out, for getting positions on university boards. These are things that we can do. You don't necessarily need to be, $1 million donor to get these positions. You need to provide your time, service, and commitment to these positions. So go back, think about starting a Muslim Alumni Association if you haven't one. Start a WhatsApp group. We just started one at Rutgers University. There's one at Stanford. There's a few that are starting to develop. Organize your alumni associations and start to get more involved in the university system that you graduated from.
As we've heard on this episode, the road ahead for political engagement and activism within the Muslim community is challenging, but also full of opportunity. We thank our guests, Dr. Chouhoud, Imam Saadiq, Sister Linda, and Salman, for sharing their valuable insights and experiences. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe today and leave a review. To learn more about the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, also known as ISPU, and our ongoing work, visit our website at ispu.org. You can also find us on X and Facebook at the ISPU and on Instagram at @the_ISPU for updates and more content. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us again soon.